Intimate Judaism deals with sensitive topics and uses explicit language. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to Intimate Judaism. I'm Rabbi Scott Kahn.
I'm Talli Rosenbaum.
And we thank you all for listening to Intimate Judaism, and we appreciate your sharing and promoting this podcast. Because of the sensitive topics that Talli and I discuss, we really need your help to let people know about this podcast. So please continue to share and help us get the word out. Also, please make sure to visit our website, intimatejudaism.com, for the full podcast archive, show notes, a free men's mikvah list, and much more. And please continue to send us your questions and comments to intimatejudaism@jewishcoffeehouse.com. And Talli, in fact, that is what we're going to talk about today.
Yes, we have been getting lots of questions from our listeners, and we thought, wouldn't it be fun to take an entire episode and devote it to reading and answering our listeners' questions? After all, relationships do involve dynamics. We can't just decide everything ourselves.
So with that, Talli, let's just launch in. We received many more questions than we're reciting today, but we chose a small selection of them, and here goes. Talli, why don't you read the first question that we have on the table?
Okay, here's the first question. Is it allowed to have a woman's tubes tied or for a man to have a vasectomy so that women don't need to endanger their health with hormones for birth control or in order to avoid becoming a nida? I cannot even think about being a nida for the next 30 years every month or so. And when I'm done with having kids, I don't mind making that permanent.
So from a halachic perspective, and this question obviously is coming from a halachic place, I'm not a posek, but I think it's pretty clear according to the vast majority of opinions, as far as I know, that both a vasectomy and tubal ligation are not allowed according to Jewish law. Let me briefly give you the source for them. The basic source comes from Vayikra, Perek Kaf Bet, Pasuk Kaf Daled, Uma'uch v'katut v'natuk v'charut lo takrivu l'Hashem uvartachem lo ta'asu. There's also another pasuk in Devarim Kaf Gimel Bet, which deals with a similar issue about whether someone who's had a vasectomy or literally crushed testicles is allowed to get married. The Gemara at Masechet Shabbos Daf Kuf Yud Amud Bet understands this as saying that one is not allowed to sterilize a man, and that's actually an Isser D'Oraita, a Torah prohibition. The Rambam in Hilchot Isurei Bia Perek Tet Zayin 16 Halachot Yud Yud Aleph 10 and 11 explains that sterilizing a man is a Torah prohibition and sterilizing a woman is a rabbinic prohibition. He says that one would be patur, which is understood by the Magid Mishnah there as meaning patur val asur. It's exempt from punishment because it's not a Torah prohibition, but it is a rabbinic prohibition. It could be there are other opinions that I don't know about, but to me, the basic halachic opinion that I understand, according to these sources and others, is that tubal ligation and vasectomies are prohibited according to Jewish law.
Thank you for answering the question, Scott. And as is our way, you, the rabbi, hear the question and answer it. And I, the therapist, hear the question and want to understand more about what's behind it. So a few things that come up for me in this question is that there are two issues being raised here. One is the issue of hormonal birth control being potentially dangerous. And we've spoken about that in our last podcast about NIDA. And the other one is about not wanting to get pregnant and wanting to have a permanent solution and not wanting to have to be
deal
a
with Hilchot Nida.
So
right.
The thing is that in order to not deal with Hilchot Nida, you sort of have to use a hormonal contraceptive. So that doesn't really help you for your dilemma about how do I avoid being a nida. The only way to avoid being a nida would really be to use hormonal birth control. I mean, obviously, most people, unless they have another reason, are not going to do something other than that, such as a hysterectomy or a uterine ablation or other procedures that would stop periods. That would be extreme. So in terms of the need to use an alternative birth control because you don't want to use hormones, it's important to know that there are many alternative methods of birth control other than hormonal birth control, such as barrier methods, such as the IUD. And it's also important to know, I believe, about the FAM method, which is the fertility awareness method, which many women use in order to track their ovulation, know exactly when they are ovulating. This helps women to avoid pregnancy. It also helps couples to facilitate their pregnancy. And it's a general way to become a lot more involved and connected to your body. So that's just something I wanted to throw out there to our listeners who don't already know about this.
Let me just give a concluding remark about this, which is that birth control itself is a halachic question as well. I'm not going to say one way or the other whether it's permitted in any given circumstance. I wouldn't do that. However, whether birth control is permitted at all, and assuming that it is in a given case, what methods are usable is not a decision which can be taken lightly. One should speak to a halachic authority about that before making that decision. Let's go on to the next question, Talli. I was hoping you could talk a little about asexuality. Are there any religiously required acts that need to take place, especially in an otherwise sexless marriage? Would all the rules of nida apply when there's no chance of sex occurring? As a sex therapist, do you run into asexual people or relationships where one person is asexual? What do you say to them? What kind of compromises are healthy and which aren't?
This is a great email. I was really happy that we got this because I think that, we have many sectors of individuals and communities who tend to get marginalized and their needs don't get met. So this is really an opportunity to be inclusive. There's another question about a gay couple, and I think we are going to have to devote an entire episode to LGBTQA. But I do want to relate to the question about asexuality because asexuality is not well understood. And not only is it not well understood in the lay community, it's not that well understood in the mental health community, and even it's not that well understood in the sexual health community. Many therapists need to go through extensive training in order to even accept and believe that there is such an orientation. So to those who are not aware of it, asexual people are people who identify with asexuality, which is not about a physical attraction. In other words, there are different types of asexuals. There are asexual people who can feel romantically attracted or they can feel aesthetically attracted, and they certainly long for emotional intimacy and to some extent physical intimacy, holding hands, cuddling, but they're not wired with that same urgent sexual need to fulfill. And this, of course, can make a relationship with somebody who is not wired that way very difficult. And in fact, the answer to the question about if I have seen this, yes, I have in my practice. And the question about what do I say to them or what kind of compromises are healthy and which aren't, that's very complex. Because in one case that I worked with, there wasn't really an ability to compromise and provide sexual acts without the asexual person feeling very exposed and almost traumatized by doing them. It's very difficult to engage in a sexual act as a favor when you're only gratifying the other person. And if there is a history of any kind of trauma or sex abuse in the past where you have been an object of somebody else's gratification, having relations in this way would certainly trigger that. So I think that these are important issues. I would love to hear what you have to say, however, about the halacha questions that are being raised.
Well, the truth is, this question was very difficult when I was doing some research on it. I spoke to one of my Rabbeim. There's just not that much that I know about that deals with asexuality per se. I will say that when it comes to marriage, a marriage in which there isn't sex, I'm phrasing that carefully, is not inherently a problem. That harkens back to a previous episode number 9, when we talked about
sexual obligations.
Exactly, obligation within marriage. That's one thing as long as both partners are on the same page. However, a marriage into which two partners enter with the knowledge that they are never going to consummate this marriage sexually is in all likelihood not a halachically valid marriage. In other words, marriage is almost defined as a relationship which will be consummated sexually. So if in advance they know that's not going to happen, it might not be a Torah law marriage. So that's an important point to make. Once they're in the marriage, things are different. There are certain stories, I believe, I could be wrong, that Rabbi Nachman of Breslov had a condition with his second wife after his first wife died, that theirs would not be a sexual relationship. I don't know how this works halachically in terms of what I just mentioned, if he meant after they consummate, if the story is even true. As the rabbi I spoke with mentioned as well, Moshe and Tzipora, according to Chazal, did not have a sexual relationship, even though initially they did. Once Moshe became Moshe Rabbeinu, the prophet, at that point, they ended their sexual relationship. So such things do exist, and there are templates of a sort, but on the whole, there's very little that's written about this that I could find at least. One more point I will make, though, is assuming that there is a valid marriage and assuming that they're in it and they decide not to have sex anymore, because they are asexual and they're not interested. My feeling is that when it comes to nida, would they still have to observe the laws of nida? The answer is yes, because we have a concept in halacha called lo plug, which is that once there's a decree, we largely don't make distinctions for individual cases. Obviously, there can be exceptions, but those exceptions are codified into halacha as such. To simply say they're not interested and therefore they're allowed to touch during nida days, I don't believe that would be possible.
Even though these are harchakot, which are there to prevent leading to something which wouldn't even happen.
Correct. I think that's true. Once again, it could be a posek would argue differently from what I'm saying now. My inclination is to say that the din of lo plug, of not making distinctions, applies to harchakot. In the same way one could argue, I realize it's a very different situation, that passing doesn't get me turned on at all, so therefore I don't have to follow it. We'd say that's not how it works. The rules are the rules. The harchakot, the distancings are there, and they're there for the general need. And your specific instance isn't being addressed by that. And my feeling is that would apply to asexual couples as well.
Well, what I think is so important about this question is that it indicates to what extent people who identify differently than the average heterosexual couple still identify very strongly with halacha and want to be able to observe the laws that are required. Here we have a question that is saying, I am not your average heterosexual person to which it seems the Torah is addressing. How do I maintain my commitment to Jewish law and still identify with my authentic self? And I think that
should be
teaches
applauded.
us a lot.
It's tremendous that a person would care so much, in the sense that I don't feel I'm being addressed by this, but I don't want to let go. I don't want to say, therefore, I'm simply going to drop the whole thing. I think that we have to make room to answer questions honestly, while at the same time being welcoming and saying, don't be afraid to ask your questions. And if there are solutions within halacha, we'll try to find solutions. But if we can't find solutions within halacha, we don't want to make you feel excluded nonetheless. We want to make sure you feel part of the community.
And I think that this issue of inclusion brings us to our next question.
Right. So let me read this next question, Talli. We have had close family friends who are gay men. I find it hard to accept that there is a prohibition against gay men living a happy life and finding companionship. I know that it's often said that this is an option and a choice, but our friends said they knew they were gay since they were young. I feel like every Jewish person should find a home in Orthodoxy, but how could these gay men find a place in Orthodox Judaism? As you said about the previous question, this also requires its own episode, at least one. And this is a very, very big question. But how would you answer this person, Talli? What's your first initial reaction?
Well, my first initial reaction is that, we have a set of values, and included in our set of values is tzniut, modesty. And what's included in modesty is that we don't really question what other people do in their bedroom. I would even question, our listener asks, I find it hard to accept that there is a prohibition against gay men living a happy life and finding companionship. I'm not so sure, and I'm not an expert, that there is such a prohibition. I think that there, from what I understand, is a specific prohibition against a specific act. And I don't think that that necessarily means that gay men are expected to give up on the idea of companionship and a happy life. As far as that specific act, you don't know what people do in their bedroom. You don't ask heterosexual people what they do in their bedroom. And I think that the same would apply. I believe that we need to reach out and be inclusive to all Jews who want to be committed, and even those who do not. They should be included. They should be included at our Shabbat tables. They should be included in our shuls. They should be invited to our family gatherings and bar mitzvahs and weddings. And there should not be any sort of marginalization of quote unquote other.
This question, as we've been saying, requires so much more than can be said just as one question among many in a podcast. So we will reserve, or at least I'll reserve, a more extensive treatment of this topic for a different time. But I want to mention something that Rabbi Riskin said, Rabbi Shlomo Riskin from Efrat, said about a year and a half ago in a well-known and very, very controversial interview. And I'm going to agree with one thing he said and disagree with another thing that he said. But Mechilat Kvodo, I'm reading a translation of this Hebrew interview right now. Just the last line, in terms of the thing that I agree with very strongly, my approach is that every Jew should be loved wherever he is. We must permit homosexuals to receive religious honors at the synagogue. I do not ask them what they do in their privacy. It's not my business. Judgment is for God. And by this, Rabbi Riskin is saying, we don't know what goes on behind closed doors. The same is true for any person, whether he's Shomer Shabbat. I don't really know if the people in my community are Shomer Shabbat. I can only see that in front of me they're being Shomer Shabbat, and therefore I have to assume they are otherwise. And I think the same thing should apply to homosexual couples. We don't know what they do in the privacy of their rooms, and it's not for me to know anyway. The bottom line is that we have to be welcoming. We have to bring people in, as you and I have been saying repeatedly. That's a very, very important point. I think Rabbi Riskin is absolutely on the mark in saying this. Where I disagree with him
How dare you disagree with Rabbi Riskin?
I know. It's not my place to disagree with him. I can hang my hat on higher trees and stronger people than me because almost everyone disagrees with Rabbi Riskin on this particular point within the Orthodox community. The larger part of the interview was he tried to say, and without putting words in his mouth, I'm reading what it says here, it's possible that he would say, he was misquoted, I don't know. But fundamentally, he argued that the law against homosexuality, male homosexuality in the Torah, which is what the Torah prohibits, male homosexuality, female homosexuality is a different issue. And before I say that, there is no prohibition about being gay per se. It's about having a very specific and doing a very specific act, as you mentioned at the beginning, Talli. Rabbi Riskin argues that the prohibition against this particular act is applying to somebody who is perhaps bisexual, who has a choice in the matter, who is doing it not because it's the only option for him sexually. He argues, however, that somebody who feels he has no choice falls under the category or might fall under the category of what's called in Halacha ones rachmana patre, which is that someone who is coerced is exempt by Torah law. That's his argument. The problem with this is that I think by saying this, he's using the term onus in a way that is not normally used. He's extending it, in my opinion, somewhat past the breaking point. Onus is classically someone puts a gun to someone's head and say, do this halacha, do this aveira, do this prohibition, or I'll kill you. That's an example of onus. And apart from that fact, when it comes to arayot, which are sexual laws, the usual rules of onus rachmana patre is not necessarily applicable. And I am not going to judge anybody. As Rabbi Riskin said, judgment is for God. I'm not judging. However, to sanction something halachically, to say this is a priori okay, or even after the fact, I'm sure it's okay halachically, as opposed to saying this is between you and God and I'm not going to judge, but to say halachically it actually has the imprimatur of halacha, I don't think we can do that. And it's very, very painful. And the fact that it's painful is something which tears me up. I feel for people who are unable to be satisfied sexually and also be able to fulfill themselves sexually within halacha as it's classically understood. At the same time, this is what Torah says and this is what halacha says. And there's going to be a lot written on this, I'm sure, over the next 10, 15, 20, 100 years because this is such a big issue. But I don't know how we're going to get past it while saying that it's mutar and halacha. I just don't see that.
Well, in defense of Rabbi Riskin's very brave and humane response, first of all, it makes sense because I think that any sort of historical knowledge we have about homosexual acts did not occur in an exclusively gay-oriented environment. Our sources don't talk about gay people. Our Torah does talk about gay sex, meaning that there probably has always been an understanding that heterosexual people would have gay sex. I think there was a very good shiur that I had heard about this by this Rabbi Dweck.
Mm-hmm. Yes, Rabbi Joseph Dweck in London.
Yeah, that's if you
who also got in big trouble for what he said.
He got in big trouble for what he said, but it really made a lot of sense. So I think that what Rabbi Riskin is saying is that for people who do not fall into this category, who are not able to fulfill any sort of or experience any sort of satisfaction or intimacy in their lives in any other way, the issue of onus or feeling anus is really more of an emotional feeling of loss and I would say even compulsion because, to what extent am I able to give up on myself, my need for intimacy, my need for connection, and to what extent will my own mental health be affected, be threatened by this particular condition? And I think that this is what causes people to decide, well, I can't be gay and Orthodox at the same time. One of those things has to give. And I think that is what Rabbi Riskin is talking about here.
Well, from that perspective, I agree with you in the sense that when the questioner asks, I feel like every Jewish person should find a home in Orthodoxy, how could these gay men find a place in Orthodox Judaism? The answer is, hopefully, easily. I know that's not true necessarily in practice, but at least in theory, it should be that they should find a place like anybody else. They shouldn't be excluded. We shouldn't take being homosexual and put it as a separate sin, different from any other thing that a person would do about which we don't question
I wouldn't
them.
call it a separate sin.
But what I mean is
Even
that...
saying that
No, but I'll
is
tell you what I mean by that. I'll tell you exactly
kind
what
of
I mean.
offensive, I think.
Well, no,
to
I'm not. I'm telling you how people talk about it. People treat, if you're a gay couple or if you're openly gay, they put you in a different category than if you're not Shomer Shabbat, or if you don't keep kashrut, or if you don't put on tefillin in the morning, or if you speak Lashon Hara.
But why should people be identified by their sin?
Talli, I think you're misunderstanding me. I'm saying people look at them like that. They say being gay is a sin, which is unacceptable.
But being gay is not a sin.
I'm not.
It's the act.
I'm saying how people look at it. I'm agreeing with you. Being gay is certainly not a sin. I'm saying that in the larger Jewish community, very often that's looked at as, that's a different category of sin. I'm not saying being gay is a sin. I'm saying, I agree, the act is what's sinful, not being gay, not an inclination. But people treat it as though this person is in a different category than people who are in other categories of sin that are not approved by the Torah, such as not keeping Shabbat.
Okay, well, there's another thing here too that we don't really know, and I read something that was written by Rav Aaron Lichtenstein. We don't really know what to'eva means.
That's another point, which is that you're referring to the fact that the Torah calls gay sex a to'eva, which is generally translated as abomination. The problem is that there are many other things that are also called a to'eva, such as eating types of not kosher food. Looking at it as abomination in English, it sounds much stronger than one would say when referring to it as eating non-kosher food. I think an approach which often has been cited, which I think is smart in terms of a way of approaching this, is that the word to'eva sometimes make us think that this is a real moral wrong. And instead of thinking of it as a classic moral wrong, maybe we can think of it as a religious wrong. That having gay sex is a religious prohibition. Once it's no longer an ethical violation per se in our minds, it allows us to be more welcoming. That doesn't mean we're saying it's mutar. I would not say that. I'm not saying that. But by putting it out of the category of abomination in the sense of something which is morally reprehensible in that sense, rather than something which is religiously offensive.
That's a great point. Thanks, Scott, for that. That makes sense. All right, let's move on because we have to save some of that for our special episode.
I'm sure we have plenty left. I'm not worried.
Yeah.
Okay, the next question is this. I am a father, and my daughter is in 9th grade. We are a pretty frum, dati lumi, that means national religious family, and she confided in me that a boy started speaking to her over WhatsApp. From one perspective, our background makes me want to say no boys and to instruct my daughter not to speak to him. But from a different perspective, this is likely normal for kids that age. What should I do? P.S. I was definitely talking to girls when I was that age.
Okay.
Okay,
you want me to answer that
Take
question?
Take it away.
Okay. There are a lot of perspectives here that have to do with the society in which you live, the values that you believe in, and obviously what the Halacha says about this, which I'll let you speak to. The question is, should I let my daughter talk to boys? First of all, she probably already is if you're living in a national religious setting. In the national religious or modern Orthodox setting, there are coeducational opportunities. Kids get together. They get together in the neighborhoods. They get together in Bnei Akiva or Ezra. There are certainly the more far-right parts of the national religious culture in which there is a lot more separation, and communication or socialization between boys and girls is not encouraged at all. In fact, is discouraged until it's time to be dating for the purpose of marriage. And that's quite similar to the ultra-Orthodox or Haredi approach.
Right.
What's really important is consistency. It's important that we maintain an entitlement to the values that we have. And if our values are that we don't want our kids to socialize with the other gender, then you kind of need to live a life that makes it easy to do that. You can't have it both ways. You can't say don't talk to boys, but
exactly.
live in a neighborhood or a community where everyone's doing that, because that's confusing. And also, I think what's important is not to set strong rules, but to first open up the conversation, be really curious, make it so that these are the kind of conversations that we can have together. What is it about, talking to boys? What does it feel like? What tools do you have? Keep the lines of communication open. If you're going to talk to boys, relationships that you are having, are they similar to the relationships that you have with girls, or are they different? In what way are they different? How do we make them respectful relationships? How do we grow from them? If there is a conflict, how do we resolve that conflict? If there is a misunderstanding, or if there is some sort of romantic or sexual stuff that can happen when you have mixed gender activities, how do we negotiate that? How do we talk about it? How do we not feel shame? How do we feel normal? How do we normalize it? So I think that as long as you have a language and you're not hesitant to open up the lines of communication, I'm not saying that kids are necessarily going to be so eager to engage.
Well, you don't think so?
Back. But if we start early enough and make it normal enough from a very early age, then it's not going to be awkward or weird for kids to talk about these things with their parents.
And from a halachic perspective, I don't think there's that much to say. I really think this is a question of what your own feeling is as a parent, where you want to raise your child and what style do you want to raise your child. Halachically, this is not a matter of yichud, of being a lone boy and girl. That is a halachic category, but simply talking isn't generally considered a halachic category. In fact, this week I was talking to my son, Ephraim, extensively. He was having an argument with somebody about the Mishnah in Pirkei Avot, which says, Al tarbe isticha im haisha, do not have a lot of speech, do not have a lot of talking. We have to define the word sicha as the key word over here with a woman. And then it says, it's talking about your wife. How much more so it's referring to
someone else's wife.
Someone else's wife. Given that, the person was arguing, therefore, that one should never speak to women. And this is a friend of his, they're in their early 20s. This is a much, much bigger topic. I was trying to argue to my son, and he was readily accepting it. He wanted to know how to argue back, that every word in this Mishnah has to be taken under close consideration with a microscope. What does the word sicha mean? We're talking about the kind of talk you don't even have with your wife. It's not talking about any other kind of talk. And to me, whether or not one wants his child or her child to speak to kids of the opposite gender is really a question for the parents to decide in terms of how they want to raise their child. I remember my teacher, Rabbi Moshe Simkovich, with whom I'm very close. He spoke under my chuppah when I got married. I hope I don't misquote him, but I remember when he was opening up a high school in Philadelphia, he had the question, should the classes be together or separate? And in the end, I believe they actually had the classes separate for various reasons. But at one point, he had in mind or thought about doing something which was almost counterintuitive. In some schools, you have classes together, like my school of Maimonides, where I went. Other schools, the classes are entirely separate. And some of them, it seems, they have Limudei Kodesh separately, when you have secular subjects there together, but holy subjects, learning Torah and Nach and Halacha, they'll be separate. Perhaps because of the holiness, they don't want boys and girls flirting, I don't know. He said he would actually flip that. If anything, he would have the Limudei Kodesh, the holy subjects, with boys and girls together, and the secular subjects apart. Why? As he put it, because I'd rather have a Torah teacher tell boys and girls how to interact rather than a math teacher who wasn't necessarily trained in Torah like that. So at least from that perspective, it's an interesting way of looking at it. But to me, it seems largely a pedagogical question more than anything else.
That's very interesting because as far as educational questions go, they've done studies on same-sex versus mixed gender education, even in secular settings, because apparently girls can tend to shut down their intelligence in front of boys. I'm fairly sure that's changing. I should hope so. But I think this also has to do with socialization. I'm glad you brought that Mishnah from Avot, because what we don't want to do is, even if we are very, more to the right or Haredi, and we don't believe in our kids interacting, and that's certainly a legitimate point of view, what we don't want to use is a Mishnah like that for the reason why we don't want it.
Well, among many reasons, you don't actually paskin from a Mishnah. And that's first
right,
of all,
but we don't really want to give that, girls are a waste of time and they're frivolous and they're dumb and it's, you don't want to waste your time. That really doesn't properly respect the girls who are probably, at least in many areas, just as, if not smarter, and, especially in kind of our communities where the girls are learning Gemara the same level as the boys. And that's not the reason you want to give. And
just as long as we're talking about that Mishnah, once again, an entire episode could be devoted to this, but the ultimate answer I gave to my son Ephraim was, forget the meaning of this Mishnah. Forget it. Just even put it aside, because there's a much bigger point, which is that you can take any line out of this massive literature called Jewish law, which includes both Talmuds, the Mishnah, not to mention the entire Tanakh, all the Rishonim, all the Achronim, and the Poskim. You can take any line out of context, or even in context, and prove anything you want. What has to be done is to take the entire literature and then distill how behavior has been decided according to the authorities, whether in the Gemara, the Rishonim, the Achronim. Taking one point, as I say, even if it's in context, even if a rabbi said something in a particular context, which is not how we paskin, you can't do that. You have to look at the entire literature, which is why deciding halacha is such a serious burden, because one has to know a huge amount in order to really determine that. So taking anything out of context or even in context can't be the source of halacha. You can prove anything you want if you look at things in a shallow and isolated way.
Yeah, and one more point that I would make as a parenting point is that when I say to keep the lines of communication open, I have seen so many, I've worked with many, many young people in their early stages of dating and marriage, and many of them will report this kind of ambivalent experience of guilt and shame because they would go out and meet boys and girls, but it would be in secret. And part of the reason why it would be in secret is because reputation was very valued in their communities. And a girl who would be seen with a boy, it would affect her shidduch chances, or it would affect her name or her reputation. So in order to meet members of the opposite gender, it would be something that was done with conflict and ambivalence and secrecy and some amount of guilt and shame. Whereas if you're going to do it openly, do it with permission and with open lines of communication so that you can talk about the interactions with your parents who love you and want to help you and want to protect you if that's the case.
You know, Talli, I have a rule that every podcast I have to at least allude to Rabbi Soloveitchik, the Rav, at least one time. So this is my one chance. And with this, we'll move on to the next question. I'll just say one more point, that his sister, Shulamit Soloveitchik Meiselman, wrote a book called The Soloveitchik Heritage. Came out, I think, over 20 years ago. And one scene which was very important to me when I saw it, the Rav's mother was much more open to Western studies and secular studies than his father. His father was a brisker, was very against it. And at one point, the Rav's mother brought home some books from the library. And the Rav's father was extremely upset with her. So she quietly took him, the Rav's father, up to the Rav's room when he was just a child and showed him a bunch of books sort of stashed under the mattress or under the bed in a secret place. And she said, here's your choice. He'll either do it clandestinely in such a way that we won't know about it, or I can choose the books that he gets to read, okay? It's your choice. But the idea that he won't do anything at all just because you don't like it, that's not going to happen. And what you're saying is the same thing would apply to anything like this when you deal with children talking to each other. Obviously, maybe it doesn't happen, but it's very likely that it is happening. So in that case, make sure you model good behavior and make sure they're doing it in such a way where they have open lines of communication, where they can talk about it with you rather than doing it in a private way, which can lead to guilt and perhaps not knowing how to interact in a healthy way.
Absolutely. I think we have one more question.
Let's go for it. Why don't you read it?
I sometimes feel that the rules of Nida are very Talibanish, especially the idea of women having to do bidikot daily for the Shiva Nekiyim. Again, I'm just going to translate because not all our listeners will be familiar. Bidikot are the internal vaginal examinations that a woman does in order to determine her status, and Shiva Nekiyim are the 7 clean days. Isn't that way too invasive and over the top?
So first of all, before anything else, I would suggest that people who find this question important would listen to our previous episode, episode 10, which was all about family purity and strains in marriage and difficulties that one would have following the laws of Nida. So please listen to that. I know that the questioner didn't mean it like this, but I take issue with calling it Talibanish only because using a phrase like that already puts anyone trying to answer the question behind the 8 ball. You're already classifying it in a very, very negative way. Even if it is negative, you're putting it into a category of these wicked people who oppress women, as opposed to asking it in a more neutral way, which I think would be the fair way. When people think of the Taliban, you think of 9/11, you think of the fact that they oppress women and not only prevent them from having education, prevent them from going out in public without a man who's related to them, and many other things of that same sort. If a woman violates this oppression, they beat her or kill her. So therefore, by saying, aren't these laws Talibanish? The answer is not at all, because in Jewish law, the woman is doing it by choice. There is no one imposing it except for the woman herself and God in the Torah. So if a person believes that these are divine mandates that were dictated by God, then calling it a Taliban type thing doesn't make a lot of sense. And if you don't, well, then it's up to whether it's still your autonomy, whether you want to keep it or not. So I take issue with that phrase. I think it's not really fair to put it in those terms. In terms of what's really being asked over here, whether it's invasive and over the top. As a male, it's not for me to say whether a woman finds it invasive and over the top. I do know that there are many women who do not. There probably are some who do. But once again, a person has autonomy. A person has a choice in the sense that we have free will. A person can follow these laws or not. And if a person is following these laws, then that person obviously decided that the divine dictate, assuming he holds that the divine dictate to do this, is important to him or her. I don't have much to say except that that's the halacha, and the halacha sometimes asks us to do certain things. It's something which inherently should not be painful. It might be invasive, but okay, I guess, there are a lot of things that are painful, whether it's in halacha or in medicine or in many other areas, and we accept them because we believe that they're true.
I see you got very triggered by this question, and it makes sense for you as a rabbi. You hear this question and, you're very committed to not only upholding Jewish law, but to helping others do so.
Upholding its reputation.
Yes, yeah. Of course, I'm going to read this question differently as a therapist. And
that's your job.
Yeah, and look at the complexity and the dilemma. If somebody is saying that they feel that the rules of Nida are very Talibanish, they're experiencing something which feels very hurtful to them. It is invasive. It is injuring to them. There is an internal conflict going on between their desire to live their lives as a Jew, otherwise they wouldn't be doing it. Anybody, like you said, can choose not to. And
the question would never come up, obviously. Right.
And then it wouldn't come up. They would say, this is ridiculous. I'm not doing this. Goodbye. This person is not doing that. And by the way, we didn't get a chance to read all of our letters from last time, but we also had a very good letter from a couple who talked about how they believe that the Nida laws are primitive and archaic and horrible, but they do. And they do it all because they're committed, but they're still having very strong words to describe what it feels like for them. And so I think we need to look at the conflict, and I think we need to honor the place that feels victimized by it. Taliban is a strong word, but there's a reason for using that word. And then what I would want to do is get a better sense of what they are feeling of their own agency or autonomy and where this originated in their lives, because, when we choose to observe and to live a life of meaning and to live an authentic life the way that we feel genuine, it requires doing it in a way that we can live with and not in a way that we wake up in the morning feeling victimized by external laws. I think we want to look at what is their experience of being invaded. What is their experience of, we talked about in the last podcast a little bit about feeling abandoned, women who felt abandoned by becoming Nida. We have to be sensitive, and rabbis, when they're asked questions, need to be sensitive to the emotional experience that some of these halachic requirements can arouse and trigger in individuals and in couples.
You see, Talli, it's very interesting because when I saw the word Taliban, my initial thought was, that's an unfair question. But you took it from a different direction. You said, you obviously are feeling very victimized by that. So I think both sides have to be addressed over here. I think that's very good. I will make one more point, though, which is that one should speak to a halachic authority, whether a Yoetzet Halacha or a person's rabbi, because in terms of this, if there is a reason why a person feels very uncomfortable doing b'dikot during the Shiva Nikiyim, there might be in certain cases various leniencies. The b'dikot, for those who don't know, what's generally done is after a woman stops bleeding, she then does a hefsek tara, which is an initial check to make sure she stopped bleeding. She then counts the Shiva Nikiyim, the 7 clean days. And on each of those 7 clean days, she checks herself twice, once in the morning and once in the later afternoon. And if she's clean for all 7 days, she then goes to the mikvah, which means there have been 15 checks. And if one finds it very difficult to do so, one should speak to a halachic authority because there might be situations when one can reduce that number when necessary.
Yeah, and I think that what is important for women who feel that this is quite invasive, time-consuming, and annoying, I think it's important to at least for rabbis and halachic authorities and yoatzot to give these women some validation for that. It's not always about having to fix their problem, but to be empathic to how hard that actually is to do.
I will point out, though, this question was actually asked by a man. And one of the reasons that I felt more upset about the way it was phrased was the very fact the person wasn't personally being victimized by this. It was just his natural feeling towards it, maybe because his wife feels that way, that's different. But when a man asked it, for some reason, I felt it was less fair to say it was Talibanish than a woman who feels victimized by it, in which case perhaps I'd have more empathy. But maybe not, I don't know. I'm not a very empathic person all the time. But I try, we'll see.
Okay, that's great.
Well, I hope everyone enjoyed this episode. This is a lot of fun, Talli.
Please keep your questions coming because we want to choose episodes that really will be of interest to you.
We can't answer every question by email, so we apologize in advance, but we try to respond when we can. Write to intimatejudaism@jewishcoffeehouse.com. In the future, we hope to have more episodes like this where we take your questions and try to give our brief al regel achat quick answers to them.
Look forward to upcoming episodes. As we said, some of the episodes that we will be doing in the future will include LGBTQA. We are hoping to do an episode on the very loaded topic of infidelity in marriage. And if you have other ideas, other topics that you would like us to speak about, email us.
We always appreciate your contact. We always appreciate the fact that you share and subscribe. Please go to intimatejudaism.com for show notes for this and all of our episodes. We have our podcast archive over there. Plus, you can join our email list. You can get a free men's mikvah list, which we put together, and many other things. Thank you once again for listening. I'm Scott Kahn.
I'm Talli Rosenbaum. Bye.